Okay, we're going to be talking about win cons again. The thing to remember is that even for an individual champion, even for a single champion, their win con can change depending on the game, depending on their team comp and the enemy team comp. And so even one champion might have different win cons in different circumstances. So we were starting really broad last time when we went over what win cons were in general most of the time for each role. And now we're going to break it down a little bit more specific and cover different types of champions in different roles and how they might go about winning the game. So when we look here, if we go to top lane, I'm really seeing for the most played champions in top lane, two categories. You're basically putting all of these champions here into either a tank or a fighter. And if you're playing a fighter top lane, obviously you have a little bit more power in lane in order to kind of bully and build up a CS lead versus your opponent. But usually the tank champion is going to start to outscale you, usually, and have more of an impact in team fights. And so in general, the tank champion is going to have a harder time split pushing because their champion is not very good at doing damage to turrets and is going to provide more utility and help to their team in an actual 5-on-5 team fight or a 5v4 team fight. Whereas the enemy top laner that's playing a fighter is going to have more split pushing prowess because they're building damage, which is going to affect their ability to split push and hit the turret. It's going to affect their ability to clear the wave. And they're going to be strong enough as a fighter who's getting more levels, hopefully, if played correctly, than anybody else in the game. They're going to be a fighter that a lot of champions on the other team can't match. And so there's no way for the enemy team to stop them from split pushing unless they send multiple people, which obviously is the whole point of split pushing, because you can create that large advantage for your team if you're doing that appropriately. So if you're a tank, your job in lane is to lose gracefully or win if you can, if the enemy messes up and presents opportunities to you. I'll tell you that, like we were talking about before, there are going to be a lot of times where if you're playing Malphite or you're playing Cho'Gath and you're not trying to kill the enemy and you just kind of passively farm and play kind of safe, they're still going to mess up in lower elo and give you some free kills. And so all of a sudden you're going to be building a consistent lead on a tank champion that shouldn't really be winning lane, and you're going to be more useful providing utility to your team and providing a tank for your team, etc. So in general, the type of player who wants to play a fighter is the type of player who wants to carry the game more, do more damage, and be able to split push and maybe have a little bit more agency. But a tank player is going to be okay with sacrificing a little bit in the laning phase and maybe their kill potential in the laning phase in order to play a champion that is usually quite simple, so they can focus and learn other aspects of the game and then play with their team and for their team and provide a lot of utility and sometimes engage for their team when you're looking at like a champion like Malphite. And so if you're the top laner, you need to lose gracefully, or if you're the top laner who's playing a tank, you need to lose gracefully, and then you need to transition into helping your team win objectives while not allowing the enemy top laner to split push for free and snowball. And so how do you do that? How do you actually facilitate that in a game? Well, the losing gracefully part is kind of self-explanatory, right? You're just going to have to be okay with missing some CS in order to preserve your HP and be able to get as much XP as possible, even if you're missing CS, and prevent yourself from dying and feeding the enemy top laner, especially if they're a carry champion or a fighter. And what you're going to do then, and this is what a lot of top laners struggle with, is how to then translate your power as a champion, whether you're the fighter and you're really fed, or if you're the tank player and now you're kind of moving out of lane. When do you leave? What do you go do? How does this work? And so if you it's kind of nuanced, but if you leave top lane and just start perma grouping with your team, you run the risk of allowing the enemy top laner to split push in a way that's really destructive for your team, because they're going to get a lot of global gold for their team. They're going to get a lot of solo XP. They're going to get ahead of you in farm, which they probably already are, and they're going to snowball really hard. So rather than immediately grouping with your team, what you should actually do is try to match the enemy top laner and then TP two objectives rather than playing immediately at the objective. And TP advantage, and what, you know, if you have TP and they don't, or if their TP is on cooldown and you have TP, is really big in being able to facilitate this kind of play. Because if you end up going and matching top and you don't have teleport, you're not going to be able to do your job and join your team. And so you need to not go match the enemy top laner if you don't have a way to get to the fight, because you always need to be at the fight. But you need to be at the fight only if you're needed, and in a way that minimizes the impact that the enemy top laner could have through split pushing or through just farming on a side lane and snowballing on your team. And so a lot of what a tank top laner is going to do, a really good tank top laner, is they're going to lose gracefully, basically like go nearly even against the enemy top laner no matter what champion they're playing. And then they're going to take a more useful champion for team fighting and put themselves in situations where they can engage fights at good times for their team, where they're grouped, but only when they need to be. And they're going to use their ability to initiate to help their team rather than hurt their team. One of the problems is that you'll see a lot of people going for an engage anytime you can potentially go in on the enemy team. And that's not really good, because you should be engaging a fight and committing to a play and using your long cooldowns on a play only if there's some reason why you're fighting, such as like an objective that's about to spawn or that's already up that you're contesting. Because a lot of times what'll happen is the team, even well ahead, will just pull the trigger and engage on a fight, you know, a minute before dragon's up, or, you know, and then they hit this weird timing window where they've just blown all of their cooldowns. Their ults aren't going to be back up for the dragon. But even if the enemy team dies, they'll respawn and be able to fight the dragon with all their stuff. And so potentially taking these like bad timings on fights is really, really bad for your team. And a good top laner who's playing a tank, who's going to initiate fights for their team, won't initiate these fights at either poor timings or straight up bad fights where you're not paying attention to the fact that you have a certain number of teammates on the map in different areas that aren't able to join the fight. And so a lot of times people just go in because they see one person caught out, or they can hit somebody, you know, and it looks like maybe that person will die. And even if that person does die sometimes, if it's the wrong target, or even sometimes if it's the right target, if you don't have enough people around you from your team, you'll still end up losing the team fight. So a good tank top laner is going to initiate fights after scanning the minimap for where their teammates are and making sure that you have that good understanding of how many people from your team are there and how many people from the other team are there. Now for the fighter is going to have to make a choice about whether they group and try to help their team with the objective, or whether they can get more by split pushing, even if it means their team can't fight the objective or doesn't get it. In general, split pushing is more effective in lower ranks because people aren't as aware of what's going on around the map in order to stop the person who's split pushing. And a lot of times a good top laner who recognizes when to keep pushing and when to back off is going to be able to split push really effectively and potentially end the game on their own. So there's a lot of situations where in low elo, split pushing is the correct play. However, sometimes it is just worth it, especially if you're really far ahead, to just group with your team and not overcomplicate the game at a rank where the game's complicated enough. And I'm a big proponent of this, even in my games up in Masters and GM. There are a lot of times when technically we could like have one person top, 3 people mid, 1 person bot, and it would be a more efficient way for us to push. I'm a big proponent of the NA-RAM strategy, which is to just push it down mid, because it makes the game, especially in solo queue where there's not a lot of communication and people aren't that good at actually, seeding pressure when they need to. If you send people to 1-3-1, somebody's going to get caught. One of your ones on the side is going to get caught, especially the lower rank you go. And so I'm a big proponent of just send it down mid. So if you're ahead and you're just going to win a 5v5, you don't need to be in this mentality as a fighter or as a split pusher that I have to be split pushing here all the time, that the only way I'm going to win is by split pushing. A lot of times if your team is ahead, just you deciding to actually group with your team, whereas a lot of top laners in low elo don't. They're probably the role that doesn't group with their team the most because split pushing is a huge part of their identity. If you're the person in low elo who's constantly grouping with your team and you're taking all these 5v4 fights, if the enemy top laner is a tank or isn't very good at split pushing or whatever, you're going to have, your team's really far ahead, and so you're just going to win the fight and push a bunch of stuff down with your team, even if you're trading stuff. That strategy works a lot better than trying to force your team to properly play around you split pushing. So how do we split push properly? In short, the biggest thing that you have to understand is that the pressure in the game is like a seesaw. And so sometimes your team is going to have all of the pressure on them. It's going to be 5v4 while you're off split pushing against nobody. And it's on your team to play carefully and not get caught. However, we can't assume that they're going to play properly. In fact, we know that if we're silver, gold, platinum, whatever, that they're not going to play properly and they are going to take a fight, or they are going to go in, or the enemy team is going to engage on them because they see us split pushing. And so again, that's one of the reasons why it can be good to group, is because you put a lot of onus on your team when you're split pushing like that to play the game really properly. And so you better be sure that even if your team screws up, you're going to get a lot off of split pushing. If, they only have a turret that's super far away from you left and you're about to show top or bot or whatever it is, and your team's on the other side of the map 5v4, you're putting a lot of faith in your team. And so that's something to keep in mind. But it's like the seesaw of pressure, where if you have multiple people coming to you, you shouldn't just die and hope that your team trades some objective back that's worth you dying. You should try to draw people to you, but then seed pressure at the last moment possible so that you can retreat without dying. And so what I see a lot is low elo top laners who are split pushing are just pushing up really, really far, dying, and then hoping that their team trades an objective. And that's not proper split pushing. Proper split pushing involves, I'm pushing up really far, I'm getting vision, I see that people are coming, or I don't see people on my team, or very many people on my team. I'm going to back up and wait a little bit here. It involves not showing every single wave. Sometimes you're just going to want to sit in a bush, sit in the jungle, sit back in the lane that you're split pushing, and wait to see what happens. Wait to see if a bunch of people come top or if they show up, at your team. One of the best ways when you're split pushing to guarantee that nobody's going to match you is, instead of showing that you're split pushing that lane the entire time, just sit in a bush, wait for them to all go to the objective versus your team, and then show and start split pushing once they've already made the decision to commit to your team. That way, at least, even if your team messes up, if you've put yourself in a position where, hey, if I have 30 seconds here, I'm going to take a tower, you're at least putting yourself in that situation that we talked about, where I'm guaranteeing that I'm going to get a positive play regardless of what happens with my team. I don't need my team to play perfectly. If you're split pushing and you actually end up getting caught, you're basically relying on your team in order to play well on the other side of the map, in order to punish and get an objective back. And I see some really egregious stuff happening with this all the time too. Sometimes people push up before the objectives even spawned, or when there's literally just nothing to take on the other side of the map, and they'll die split pushing and expect their team to be able to trade something on the other side of the map just because they had 2 or 3 people in their lane. And sometimes there's just dead time in League where there's no objective up and your team couldn't have possibly traded something back on the other side of the map. Or maybe there was an objective up, but you're relying on your team to get it for you dying, and they're not always capable of recognizing the play and getting the objective or starting Baron or something like that when they send 2 or 3 people at you. So it's more important when you're split pushing, especially if you're playing a carry champion, which is usually what split pushing. If you're really strong, you probably need to not die. So not dying while split pushing is actually one of the best ways to split push. That being said, obviously there are ways you can split push and die and it can be worth it. But I would say that rather than your split pushing just being about pushing as hard as you can and then dying and hoping your team trades something on the other side of the map, you should evaluate whether you should actually be split pushing or whether you could just group and win the game for free. Or if you are going to split push, try not to die when they send people at you. Because if you can bait 2 people up there and then run away and waste their time, and your team's getting the play on the other side of the map, rather than a trade, you can just get a free positive play. One of the best ways that you can facilitate this, and this may be getting a little bit too detailed, so we got to move on to some other roles, but one of the best ways you can facilitate this is by slow pushing. And so here's what you're going to do. When you push a minion wave, what most people do is walk up to the minion wave and kill the whole thing. But what you can actually do, which is really, really good if you're trying to split push, is walk up to the minion wave. Let's say it's back on your side of the map. It's like near your tier 2 turret, bot, or top, or whatever. Rather than killing the whole minion wave, just kill the ranged minions, just kill the caster minions, and then wait. Go do something else, wait, and then come back to top lane. The reason for this, you're going to have to give up the 3 melee minions. You're not going to be able to, or I guess you could last hit them if you really want to. But what this does is, rather than your wave taking a bunch of damage, the vast majority of a minion wave's damage is coming from those caster minions. They're the DPS. The tanky minions are super tanky and don't do very much damage. So what happens is when you kill the 3 caster minions, when you kill that back line of minions, your wave gets stuck there, 6 minions v3, but there are 3 tanky minions, and so it holds the wave there for a long time, but your wave doesn't take very much damage. So maybe one of your 6 minions die, maybe all 6 of your minions survive, and one of them's really low, and now your second wave that's coming to reinforce that wave is very close behind your wave. And so what you've done is artificially built up a gigantic wave. And because you only had to kill those 3 minions and then go away and let it do its own thing, you don't have to show that you're intending to split push that. You can just kill those 3 minions and then walk out of vision. You could even just stand there behind the wave, just out of vision. And then once the wave pushes up onto their side of the map, you wait for them to show at the objective, the dragon or whatever that they're going to fight your team at, the Baron or whatever. You wait for them to show. And then once that big minion wave's built up, and once you see that they're committed to the other side of the map, then you show on the wave. So the difference between a top laner who's playing a fighter and split pushing like that and somebody who just walks up and hits the wave the whole time is that they're going to see very telegraphed that you're intending to push this wave the whole time on the opposite side of the map of the objective, and they might send people to try to pick you. They have perfect information basically on what you're trying to do in order to make a decision. When you kill those 3 minions, they don't know most of the time in low elo whether the wave is going to push into them or not. As far as they're concerned, until the wave's actually moved up, it's not a problem. So that, if it's on your side of the map, they're not worried about clearing that wave at all. And so if it's still stuck on your side of the map, they're not worried about that wave at all. And they don't see you top anymore, except for like deep on your side. And so since they don't see you top until they're committed to the other play, it's night and day their ability to react to that. And what you ultimately want out of split pushing is not to die and trade an objective, but to, like be able to either push for free and take a bunch of towers for free, or bait people to your side of the map and then live and just waste their time, multiple people, or bait them top and then kill one of them or something like that and trade 1-for-1 and your team gets the objective. That's more of what you're trying to do when you're split pushing. You're not trying to split push and die and hope that your team trades an objective on the other side of the map, because that's just not consistent in low elo. Okay, let's move on to another role here. We got jungle, and there's a lot of different champions in jungle, but we'll see most of these are fighters and assassins. So we've got, like Lee Sin. We could talk about these champions too. So, Aatrox is a fighter, Darius is a fighter, Renekton's a fighter, Set's a fighter, Garen's a fighter, Mundo's a tank, Camille's a fighter, Volibear's kind of, these definitions are not going to, these categories are not going to overlap or fit these champions perfectly, right? So, for example, a champion like Volibear or even Renekton is sort of semi a tank and semi a fighter, right? Same thing with Mordekaiser. Jax is a fighter. Nasus is a little bit weird because he's kind of a split push champion, but he's sort of also a tank, and some could say he's a fighter because once he's scaled, with this Q, he can do a decent amount of damage in a fight. So Nasus is kind of a hard champion to categorize as well, right? He's kind of got his own unique mini game going on as far as his win condition is concerned, but you get the idea. So for jungle, we have, fighter, assassin. Shyvana's kind of her own thing. Lily is kind of an AP fighter, if you had to describe her properly. She's obviously not really a mage. She's not really an assassin. So I would describe her as, like an AP fighter. Nidalee, that's actually a tough one on Nidalee. I guess you could say Nidalee's either a fighter or an assassin, but it's kind of hard to say. Graves is a fighter. Hecarim can either be like a tank or a fighter, depending on how you build him. Nocturne's an assassin. Brand's a mage. Shaco can either be like a fighter or an assassin, depending on how you build him. Same thing, Kayn can be a fighter or an assassin. Diana, similar issues here. So we got a lot of different champions, but mostly we're seeing fighters and assassins, I guess I would say. So if you're playing a fighter jungler, a lot of times, depending on, what champions you're playing against and stuff like that, I guess it depends on the champion. If you're playing like a Lee Sin, you're going to get outscaled really hard. So what a lot of junglers are trying to do, what we talked about for the role in general last time, is you're trying to efficiently clear. And regardless of what role or what type of champion, what subclass you're playing, you're always trying to efficiently clear on jungle. And where low elo players get really lost in jungle is when they're seeing so much action happening across the map. I've got 3 lanes that are all perma-fighting, and I don't know where to go. And the best way to combat this is to clear your camps efficiently, and then when you see an opportunity along your path that doesn't take you in a very inefficient way off of what you're doing, then you go there and you assist with that play. So for example, if you're, pathing bot to top and you're finishing Raptors and you see a play mid, you could look for a gank mid. If you're finishing your clear, you're finishing blue or Gromp or whatever, and you see a play on top lane, you go top lane and you look for the play. But you do not force a play on the other side of the map that has a lot of potential to go wrong and be kind of coin flippy, especially the lower rank you're playing. So rather than hoping that gank is successful and going really far out of your way to get there, like, I see there's a lot of action going on bot, let me path bot, even though my camps are all spawning topside or something like that. what you're going to find is that a lot of low elo junglers are really inefficient in their farming, and there's too much going on, and they're not good enough at identifying good ganks to be able to basically play the game as efficiently as they could if they were just clearing efficiently and then going for plays that look really free. And so that's kind of the same no matter what type of subclass of champion you're playing. Obviously, you're generally not going to be split pushing on a fighter jungler like you would on a fighter in top lane. And, for one, the identity of a lot of these specific champions is that the top lane champions that are fighters are better at split pushing, and the jungler champions that are fighters are kind of inherently not as good at split pushing for the most part, which is maybe why they ended up in jungle or ended up in top lane in the first place. And obviously this makes sense because you can't be split pushing on the opposite side of the map when an objective spawning if you're the type of player in jungle who has to be there at the objective in order to smite and secure the objective. So regardless of whether you're playing Brand, like just a straight up mage in jungle, or whether you're playing a fighter like Lee Sin or Viego, you pretty much have to clear efficiently, make sure you're looking at your lanes and finding easy gank opportunities. Not every gank opportunity that you see, not, it looks like somebody needs help. Just, this is like really, really free. And if you cut back on actually the amount that you're ganking and you clear efficiently, you're going to find that you're going to get a really big gold lead. And like I said, whether you're playing a mage like Brand or you're playing a fighter like Lee Sin, you're going to love that gold lead. And now what do you do to actually execute on that? If you're a champion like Brand, it's relatively self-explanatory, right? The champion kind of does it for you. You get a gold lead, you clear efficiently, you helped your team a little bit, and then you get to do a lot of damage because the champion does a lot of damage and can clear really efficiently. And so you just, fight in team fights with your team and you do a lot of damage because you're a really strong couple item mage. If you're playing an assassin like Nocturne or something like that, obviously the game plan's a little bit different. Well, of course, you want the gold lead in the early game the same way by clearing efficiently and then looking for those really free plays. A champion like Nocturne is going to play fights completely differently and the mid and late game completely differently than a champion like Brand. And so when you're playing an assassin, and maybe a little bit of this will bleed into how you play mid lane assassins too, but you want to be looking for targets that are kind of isolated. Whoever is pushed up the furthest on their team, if there's like no objective up, for example, and if there is an objective up and you kind of have to be playing a certain side of the map or a certain area, then whoever you think you can get to on that side of the map who's actually overextended. But you have to be careful, right, that their team is not all there behind them coming to the objective, and that they're actually there by themselves. But you're looking for isolated targets. So you're trying to think to yourself, where is the fighting going to be? And if you have a teammate that's really overextended and on the same side as the objective, you can play, just like I talked about with support last time, you can play to protect that person. Because imagine you're playing Nocturne or Kha'Zix, and you wait in a bush or you wait in the river to the side of that play, and then when they go for your overextended teammate, you're now able to help engage a fight on them. That's a way an assassin can play. Another way you could play, like I said, is if they have somebody who's overextended, you can look for those picks. So assassins are really looking for those picks. If you find yourself in a situation where you are actually team fighting, 5-on-5, or some people are split pushing or in a side lane or whatever, but you have basically even numbers, you didn't get a pick before the fight. Obviously in the fight you're going to want to try to play to assassinate high priority targets on the other team, but in a way that doesn't just completely kill you for free. And so oftentimes trading, especially if it's not that good of a trade, if you're really strong or really fed or have a lot of your team's gold, can be quite bad. And I think that assassins get baited into using a lot of cooldowns and abilities to kill low priority targets because they're easy to kill because they're already far behind, or going in and getting a kill even on a high priority target, but not having an escape plan and just dying for free. And as a result of dying for free like that, you end up potentially losing the fight despite the fact that you got, pretty decent pick. And so when you're playing a champion, like Kha'Zix, like Nocturne, you want to target those high priority champions, and you also want to be patient. You probably shouldn't be the first one going in, but a lot of times you will see, well, a Nocturnal is a decent initiate, but let's say you're playing Kha'Zix, right? You're not going to want to be the first person going in. If you can get a free pick, sure. But if you're jumping in at their whole team, it's not going to go very well. Even if you're targeting a high priority champion, even if you do a lot of damage, fed or not fed, it's not going to go very well. Think about the way that Katarina players play, where they play very, very passively and very safe, and then only go in once a lot of abilities and cooldowns have been used. And as a result, the enemy team isn't really able to peel them as easily, or to peel you as easily as they should. And so you should be thinking about playing an assassin as, how do I find an opportunity where I can get this pick for free, whether it's before a fight or during a fight. And you're not going to get against any competent team, even any half competent team. You're not going to be able to use all of your abilities to jump in and overextend in a fight to get onto a high priority target. You're not going to be able to do that and get out unless they've already used a bunch of their abilities. And so you should kind of let your tank, let your support, let your engage, let them do the heavy lifting and get you to a point where you can just kind of clean up the fight, or you can get onto somebody for free. A lot of times, really, really important to use vision and maneuvering, like flanking and stuff like that, to make your job easier. Because if you don't have to commit those abilities to get onto somebody or to get behind them, if you can just do that through better movement and vision, then you're going to be able to use those abilities that you do have on your champion in order to escape, rather than having to use them to go in. And so now all of a sudden, you're actually going to present yourself with an opportunity to get the pick for free and then live. Really important on jungle too, because if you die, a lot of times, even if it was a really good fight, in fact, even you could have a fight where everyone on the enemy team dies and you're the only person on your team that dies. But if their jungler's still alive, like they have 4 people die, their jungler's still alive, but you die and you're your team's jungler, all of a sudden, for the most part, a lot of times, Baron and stuff like that are off the table just because of the fact that whether it's one person or not, they can just come in and smite the objective if you have no smite. And so it's really important, if you're fighting before an objective, to prioritize your life as a jungler. Another thing I'll say about jungle, really important, right, to hold your smite so that you can actually use it on the objective after the fight. I do this all the time if I'm playing jungle. A lot of times, junglers use their smite in the heat of the moment in the fight because you're used to using it every time you have it up in a fight. But when you've got an objective coming up or an objective up like that, it's another big way that junglers can unfortunately kind of throw away an objective for no reason, because they accidentally, without thinking about it, use their smite during the fight before the objective. And sometimes it goes even worse, right? Sometimes rather than not doing the objective because you don't have the smite, sometimes you do it and then lose it because you use the smite during a fight. Absolutely terrible. So that's the way you're going to be playing an assassin champion in jungle. The way you're going to be playing a fighter champion in jungle is you're going to be really strong during the mid game. Before tank champions get crazy tanky, you're essentially going to be like a tank as a bruiser or fighter champion. So you're going to be as tanky as they come at that point in the game, but you're going to be doing a lot of damage. And so you want to be looking for skirmishes and things like that that you can get to put your team ahead. But just like anyone who's looking for a fight, like we've been talking about, you need to make sure that you're paying good attention to where your teammates are so that you're not fighting when you don't realize what the numbers are actually like. So you need to pay really good attention to the minimap. You can see all of your teammates permanently. There's no excuse for going in and starting a fight when you don't know where everybody is. We kind of covered mage champion like Brand or something like that. Obviously, these champions are just going to be able to do a lot of DPS by farming efficiently and providing a little bit of help to their team. A tank jungler is going to be similar, to like a tank top laner or something like that, in the sense that, because I see a Mumu here and he's one of my favorites, you're going to be engaging fights for your team a lot of the time, and you need to be careful about what we just talked about, but you don't have to worry about stopping somebody from split pushing, so your job is a little bit easier in that way. And you're really not as reliant on gold, and that can be a good thing and a bad thing, because being not as reliant on gold means that in theory you should be ganking a little bit more than a champion who's more reliant on gold in the jungle. But that's a really good way in low elo to, when you're not able to identify good ganks that well, when your teammates aren't always going to play and you aren't always going to play the gank out very well, it's a really good way to cause a lot of chaos and mayhem in your games if you're just trying to permanently gank all the time. But it can work. Okay, in mid lane, we've really got two different types of champions here. We got a lot of assassins and we've got a lot of mages. And what we talked about last time was the game plan for a mage, which is that you've got really good wave clear, and so you're going to want to clear the wave mid and get control of that wave, and then move to a side lane to create a numbers advantage for your team. Whether that's invading with your jungler or roaming bot and getting a fight off bot with a numbers advantage. These are the type of plays that you can look for as a control mage that will, open the game up for you and help you climb a lot. Now, if you're an assassin, it's going to be a similar game plan to what we talked about with like an assassin in jungle in terms of the way that you would play a team fight. But the way that you play lane, because obviously you're doing that and that's different than jungle, is if you have wave clear, some assassins have enough wave clear that they can do the same thing that mages are looking to do and shove out a wave and then roam and try to create an advantage that way. You see Katarinas do this a lot. Zed can do it, once he has some items and stuff like that and some good wave clear. These champions can do that. But not every assassin, in fact, probably not most of them, are going to be able to do that. So mostly what you're trying to do is shut down in lane the enemy mid laner's win con for getting ahead of you. Because you're going to do more potentially in a fight if you play an assassin really well. You can like solo carry by taking out those key targets on the enemy team, no matter who they are each game. And so you need to farm and prevent the enemy mid laner from like snowballing on you and getting ahead of your team. And so it's going to involve trading with the enemy mid laner so that they don't have enough HP or mana or resources to go roam. It's going to be trying to keep up with the wave clear that a control mage has in order to pressure them into staying instead of being able to take their Braum. And eventually, once you have the tools to do so, you're going to want to actually start fighting the mid laner in lane and then start dominating team fights by being able to assassinate high priority targets that got fed on the other team. So even if you don't have much of a lead, but you've got some items now on an assassin, you're going to be able to take out a really fed AD carry or a Soraka or some key support. You're going to be able to take out those champions, and you get the added benefit of it doesn't matter what person gets fed, whether it's a fed enemy top laner or, a fed AD carry or fed support. It doesn't matter where it happens. You're going to be able to, if you just play decently and consistently and you're not too far behind, if you play the team fights well, you're going to be able to take out a really high priority target, which is going to provide a ton of value for you and your team. In AD carry, there aren't that many different types of AD carries, but we've really got two main types of AD carries, which is we've got auto attack reliant AD carries. These are your traditional AD carries, and then we've got caster AD carries. And interestingly enough, the champion that's really popular right now in AD carry, Kai'Sa, is kind of a mix of both, because she simultaneously does a lot of damage with her passive and her Q and her W and her abilities. So she's kind of like a caster because of her strong abilities, but also has the ability to obviously like auto attack a lot and carry a fight more, I guess, in the way traditional AD carry would. But I guess with her short range and stuff, you would definitely say she plays closer to a caster, I guess. Ezreal, Jhin are casters. Lucian is a caster. Misfortune is a caster. These are kind of classic ones. And then you've got auto attack reliant champions like Jinx would be the poster child for this. But you even have, like Caitlyn and Ashe. These are champions that essentially traditional AD carry champions, like we talked about last time, are going to be the main win con for AD carry that we talked about, which is to maximize your gold income, because your auto attacks do a lot more when you're able to buy your crit items. And so AD carries scale really well with gold. And if you spend a lot of time playing one of these champions and you're fighting all the time in lane, then maybe, like we said, you're learning the mechanics of your champion, and that could be okay in the long term. But in the short term, if you're trying to play the game properly and win, the issue is that if you're playing a auto attack reliant champion, a golden item reliant champion very aggressively in lane, you're oftentimes going to shut down your ability to consistently get gold compared to the rest of the map and the rest of the players in the game, because you're going to be dead and you're not going to be able to get waves, or you're going to be recalling more often than people have to, and you're not going to be getting as much gold. And so I would say that you need to minimize trading and fighting in order to prioritize your gold income, so that you can get to a later stage of the game where you have 3 items, you have 4 items, and you become a real champion where you can actually deal out a ton of damage if you play the team fight properly and don't just instant die. The problem is AD carries are very vulnerable champions. Even when they do get their item spike, you get hit by an important CC like a Malphite ult or something like that, or almost any champion gets into melee range of you and you're going to die. What you have to understand is that that's not really imbalanced. Sometimes it's imbalanced, and AD carry's definitely gotten the short end of the stick recently, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's imbalanced. The result is that a Kha'Zix or an assassin, like we were talking about, or even a tank, is never supposed to be able to get into melee range of you. If you've allowed, through your bad positioning as an AD carry, one of these champions to get on top of you and to get in melee range of you, you're supposed to die. So when I hear AD carries saying, I'm dying to tanks, it's like, what am I supposed to do? It's not balanced. AD carries should always beat tanks. AD carries beat tanks when they're free hitting them in a team fight. But AD carries aren't supposed to beat a tank if the tank manages to get on top of them. That's just not how it works. Now, maybe you can beat them anyways if you've got really good peel and your teammates are paying attention to what's happening. But let's be honest, you shouldn't expect that as an AD carry, especially the lower rank you go. So you need to be prioritizing your gold income, and then you need to be positioning properly and understanding that you can throw that gold income away very quickly if you let an assassin or let a tank get on top of you. Similarly to what we were talking about before with, I think, Katarina being this poster child of being very cautious in team fights, sitting back and waiting for everyone to use their abilities and then going in. AD carry should also position much further back than most people do, and then enter the fight once they can actually start to free hit. Another way that you can play AD carry as opposed to playing it like that is if you're really, really good, you can, and we'll probably, this is a whole video topic in and of itself, but you should play like Double Lift's Knife's Edge, which is Double Lift said that AD carry should basically be played on a knife's edge. The reason why this is really good is because if you play AD carry just at the tail end of the range of that Malphite or whatever, or you stand in range of it and you're prepared to E on Ezreal or prepared to flash or whatever it is, if you can bait out key abilities from the other team, you can make the fight a lot easier for your teammates while also managing to dish out a ton of damage, because you're such a high priority target and people love to focus you because you're squishy, that you can, your job as an AD carry a lot of times, especially if you're behind, is more so to bait out abilities and not get killed by them rather than to deal damage. And so if you can think about AD carry as baiting abilities and not getting hit by them and not dying, playing on that knife's edge so that you're getting a lot out of the enemy team but you're not getting punished for it, if you can do that, then you'll be a really successful AD carry. Now, caster AD carry champions kind of flip that whole idea and rule on its head by essentially saying, I'm going to play a champion that does a lot of damage in lane, and I'm going to punish these weak early game, slow to scale AD carry champions. And if caster AD carries were, I guess you would say, well, it depends on the balance, right? You would say, well, caster AD carries sound really good because rather than having to play passive and having to wait for these item power spikes later on into the game when solo queue games are often decided so quickly early on into the game, I can actually have agency over my lane, which is like the earliest, most important part of the game. So in some ways, sure, a caster champion could be better, but it really depends on the meta because the items that caster AD carries build could be broken or they could be balanced around the fact that, you know, that this would be obviously an advantage that they're getting early. And so in a lot of cases right now, you know, caster AD carry champions are fine, but they're not like overtuned or just straight up better, even though they might sound that way. And so caster champions are able to, you know, like we said, do a lot more damage early, punish other AD carry champions. Oftentimes they're building lethality, so they're building differently rather than building crit, but not all the time. But, you know, they tend to be able to build differently. And so they're going to do a lot of damage in the early to mid game. And their role is kind of like a fighter champion in top lane punishing a tank champion that's going to outscale them. They need to fight. They need to get ahead early in lane, carve out some advantages, build up a CS lead. And then when they get to their power spikes in the mid game, they need to, you know, essentially you are going to play the same way in a team fight, right, as an AD carry would. You're going to be a high priority target, so you can play on that knife's edge, bait out abilities without dying, try to deal as much damage as possible, and a great way to do that is to wait for a lot of abilities to be used rather than playing super far up. A lot of AD carries, especially at lower ranks, who try to play at a knife's edge are just going to die over and over again because they're too far up. So, but also, as we say all the time, you're not going to learn any better if you don't do it. So you can't just play completely AFK and expect to get better at that sort of skill, which is the best way ultimately at the end of the day at the highest level in order to play AD carries, to be able to play aggressively and far up while baiting those abilities out without it costing you a whole lot. So, you know, that's what caster AD carries are looking to do. So they're going to want to get ahead early and then use that advantage that they've gotten from early game and their power spikes with a lot of like lethality type items in the mid game in order to out damage the enemy who's hopefully behind in team fights and kind of carry fights and get objectives and close the game out before the enemy AD carry has a chance to scale. Unfortunately, one of the truths about League right now and the way that it's balanced is that scaling champions are incredibly good, because they've only been adding more comeback mechanics into the game because they feel like it's obviously more fun. It creates more interesting games where there's actually a chance to win, even if you fell behind early. And so comeback mechanics make scaling champions very good, because even if you fall behind on scaling champions who are designed to be weak early, you'll just get bounties and you'll get objective bounties, and you have a very strong potential of being able to come back, especially in lower elos where people are, a little bit prone to throwing the game. When it comes to support, there's really three types of support champions that we can kind of categorize or focus on. There are your tank supports, which are kind of like usually engaged support champions. You have poke support champions. The most true poke support champions would be really just mages that are being played in support. So they'd be, your Zareth, your Zyra, stuff like that. And then enchanters, obviously, like Janna, Soraka, Nami, Yumi, things like that. But obviously, like with all these categories, the lines blur a little bit. And so you have tank champions like Taric that are kind of half enchanter, half tank. You have, enchanter champions that have quite a lot of poke. Actually, most of them, unfortunately. And so you do get some weird overlapping patterns and things like that, and some individual champions like Pyke or Senna or something that maybe are very unique compared to the rest of them. But for the most part, they fit into these three categories, and your win condition as a tank support is to go in lane and get your AD carry an advantage by dominating lane, because you have really good ability to go in, to all in, to lock people down with CC, and to punish people for mistakes heavily in a way that will just kill them. So tank support champions are going to be really good at all-inning in lane, which is why I would basically categorize them as all-in support champions almost, rather than tanks. And then you also have really good ability to roam compared to poke champions or an enchanter. Think about what a poke champion's designed to do. They do a little bit of damage and then they leave. You're not going to roam mid and do 200 damage and then walk away. That's not going to be that good of a roam. What you're going to want to do is you're going to want to roam mid and then be able to lock that person down if they walk up too far and kill them for your mid laner. And so obviously tank support champions also have the advantage of being able to roam probably better than enchanters or poke champions, because a poke champion, they're going to show up mid and do 200 damage to somebody. A enchanter is going to show up mid and heal somebody for 200, and a tank support champion is going to lock somebody down for their mid laner, deal 200 damage, and then their mid laner is going to be able to blow the person up while they're CC'd. And so generally speaking, tank support champions also have the advantage when it comes to roaming. So obviously, like we talked about, especially depending on your AD carry champion, if you're playing with a AD carry champion that's like a what do we call it? A caster AD that wants to get ahead early, does a lot of damage in lane, is not super item dependent, then you're going to want to fight, and you're going to have a bit of a kill lane in bot, because you're going to want to build that lead. You're going to want to get really far ahead. But if you have a scaling ADC, sometimes you have to be cautious, because especially a newer tank support player or somebody who's not super good at the role is going to go in too much and risk your AD carry's ability to farm and get gold like we talked about before, rather than enabling it. And so rather than getting them additional gold by getting kills, you might go in, if you're not cognizant of where the enemy jungler is, if you're not aware of who wins 2v2, if you're going in, and your AD carry is not really willing to follow up on that play, maybe the play's a little bit too thin, or they don't see a play there, a tank support played incorrectly can actually lead to, because of its aggressive nature, lead to very bad things happening for your AD carry, because you'll take away your AD carry's ability to get that gold lead. And so a lot of times, if you can, if you have a scaling ADC like that, if you can look to make more happen by roaming than by playing through that champion, then you can play through your champions on your team that are better early game and show up in places where you're more likely to be surprising, I guess, when you go in or when you can go in than you would be by just sitting in bot lane. So tank supports / engage supports are going to try to enable their AD carry to get ahead in gold the best they can. If it's a caster ADC, that means like kill lane fighting, getting ahead that way. If it's a scaling item dependent auto attack reliant ADC, maybe if they make a really egregious mistake, you could get aggressive in lane to try to help get your AD carry that kill gold as well to help scale. But a lot of times you're going to want to make something happen more through roaming. Then, as we talked about in the mid through late game, you're going to be able to hover people who are most overextended on your team or most overextended on the enemy team to pick or prevent picks from happening, because you can basically be anywhere on the map. You're also going to help your team, get picks or not get picked by placing vision, especially around objectives and things like that, so that your team knows what's going on, knows where to be, knows when to go in, when to back off, etc. And of course, a lot of tank supports, because of their CC that they have, can also act as an engaged champion for their team in team fights. And so the same principles that we were talking about, when we were playing top lane on a tank or we're playing jungle on a tank, when we're playing these engaged champions, we need to make sure that we are aware of where all of our teammates are and that we're taking a fight that doesn't just look good on our screen, but is actually good in terms of the number of players that we have around us. And so if we pay good attention to where the enemy team is, if we pay good attention to where our teammates are, then our engages are going to improve quite a bit, rather than taking fights at the wrong time. And also, like we said, for those other roles, you're going to want to engage, around objective timers when your top laner's really far, split pushing to distract the enemy team and stuff like that. The worst time you can go in is when you're not keeping good enough track of where people are, or like a minute before, a dragon or something like that, and you kill them and they're just going to respawn in time anyways, and now all of your cooldowns are down. And you need to get back to base, and potentially they're not going to let you get back and stuff like that. So all of these things are really important for a tank engage support. An enchanter is essentially the late game scaling champion of support. And so if you're playing a Lulu, if you're playing the Yuumi, you're playing the Soraka or the Janna, you are going to do more later on in the game and in fights than any engaged support can do. And so the reality is that all you have to do is scale, scale, scale. And that works perfectly with your AD carry, who just wants to basically free farm most of the time as an item dependent champion. The only problem is that if the enemy support is able to roam and get a huge lead on the rest of your team, you're not necessarily going to be able to follow as easily, and you're not going to be able to facilitate plays or counter plays around the map as easily as an engaged support. So how do you keep them in lane? It's like the mid lane situation where you're playing an assassin versus a mage. How do you keep the enemy support in lane, without getting completely destroyed? What you need to do is you need to kind of efficiently poke the enemy support, so that, again, they don't have the resources to leave bot lane and make something happen elsewhere. Luckily, a lot of enchanters basically double as poke champions, which is kind of a best of both worlds. You're most vulnerable when the engaged champion comes back into lane and they're full HP, full resources. You haven't had time to poke them yet. They have everything up. You haven't had time to out-sustain them through healing. You haven't had time to poke them, and they're going to destroy you. So you need to be very, very careful around level 2, very careful around level 6, very careful when they come back into lane, and you need to poke them to keep them in lane so that they don't go crazy on the rest of your team through roaming if you're at a rank where people are actually roaming. Otherwise, if you're lower rank, you probably just don't even bother. And then eventually you're going to outscale them by surviving. So you need to mitigate their ability to go in on you and get a lead. And then you're just kind of naturally win the game over time. Obviously, as an enchanter, you're almost like a carry champion where you have to be very careful with your positioning. And so it's very important as an enchanter. You're actually one of the most important players on your team. You need to make sure that you're not griefing your positioning and that you're not killing yourself to save somebody who's already really gone. So if they're picking somebody and there's not a whole lot you can do for them, you can very easily on support make the situation worse by trying to help them if they're really a lost cause. And you need to stay alive because of how much healing you provide to your team. You're really almost like a carry champion when you're playing a Soraka or something like that. Now, a poke champion is going to, essentially versus a poke champion versus an engage or a tank champion is going to have to do in lane what the enchanters were trying to do by poking them out, making it so that they can't actually engage and that they're useless, controlling the wave. What you need to be most careful about as a poke champion is that if you're pushing up or pressuring too much, that you're paying really good attention to where the enemy jungler is, so that if you're winning lane really hard through your poke and through your wave clear, that you're not getting yourself killed because of it and throwing all your work and your lead away. The other thing is that honestly, a tank champion or a enchanter is probably going to outscale a AP poke champion in support. And so you're in a bit of a hard place at that point, because if the game gets too late, you're going to be less useful than those other types of champion. And so you need to, like the caster AD carry, you need to get really far ahead off in lane off of your poke, get a lot of plates, not die to the enemy jungler. And then you need to, do enough damage in team fights and before fights and stuff like that, that you can end the game and actually win the game and close out the game before the game goes on for too long and you end up losing it. Because an engaged support is going to be able to do a lot in a team fight. They're going to bring a lot of CC to the table that you're lacking. An enchanter is going to provide an insane amount of healing or shielding in a team fight. And as a poke support, you're not going to do as much damage as another AP champion. You're, creating a second AP champion if your mid laner's AP or your top laner's AP or your jungler or whatever, that they can build against, and itemize against. So you're making your mid laner almost a little bit weaker in that way. And you're not bringing the CC or the healing or shielding to the table that these other supports do. So you're going to have a lot of pressure to get ahead early and end the game before you fall off really hard. So I hope that helps people both identify the subclasses that exist in these roles in League and get a little bit more of a nuanced take on the win conditions for these types of roles and champions. And if you have any suggestions for videos and things like that, as always, leave those in the comments. Love to see those. And, I'll get around to making videos on those topics if I can. And yeah, that's it. So GG, good luck in solo queue, and have a wonderful day.